All right, well, I'm at the Secular Student Alliance conference here with Eric, and Eric's from the Center for Inquiry, and we've been having a great conversation about your background from Buffalo, New York.
Indeed.
So tell us why you're here, why you're at the Secular Student Alliance
Sure.
conference.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for having me on the show. It's exciting to have an opportunity like this to kick off the Secular Student Alliance Conference. As you said, I'm representing the Center for Inquiry here, and our organization promotes science, reason, and secular values. So we really fit into a conference like this quite well, and it's great to be able to communicate with so many like-minded folks and to get to connect with students from around the country who are interested in the work that we do. I myself, identify as a secular humanist and a skeptic. I think, my core values are about understanding what's true in the world and how we can live, our best lives as humans, given our understanding of our place in the universe.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it wasn't always that way. I was raised Catholic, and I spent a lot of time in and around the convent because my aunt was a Catholic nun. And so
Are there like 10 kids in your family?
there were in my father's family.
Okay,
It's funny you said 10. He had 9 brothers and
Nine,
sisters.
okay, I just missed.
But no, it was just me and my younger brother.
Okay.
But we did hang out in the convent with them quite a bit, and we had to go to like a Sunday school type thing to learn about Catholicism.
At the convent, not even at the church, or was that part of the church?
That was part of our church, yeah, that was separate. But we would go to the convent to visit and to spend time with the nuns. And
Yeah.
so I think as I started growing and thinking more critically about the world, I was asking a lot of my family members who were involved with the Catholic Church questions that were undoubtedly difficult for them to answer given their backgrounds, right? And I think that was one of the first seeds of doubt that were planted in me when I'm asking questions.
Asking of your parents, you mean?
My
or
parents,
broader?
or some of the nuns in the convent, or my grandfather, who was, my biggest inspiration, right? He taught me so much. He showed me how to read, and he really was always there for me to, tinker with my toys to get them working again. Like, he really helped build a foundation for critical thinking, but he was a devout man himself. And there were certain questions that I wouldn't say that he, denied answering, but he would shy away from or give me the soft answer. It's God's work, or it's, humans can't understand this, or something along those lines.
Do you think he was sincere in that way?
Well, I think so. He was a complicated man. He wasn't raised religious, but he was in the Korean War, and I know that was a really impactful experience for him, losing a lot of people that were close to him, having to go through the toils of war. And when he returned, he ended up needing open heart surgery. And his story that he told our family was that he was very scared, as you can imagine anyone would be going into such a significant medical operation. And he made a promise. He prayed and said that if he survived this ordeal, he would go to church every Sunday for the rest of his life. And he did. He did it.
But do you think he really believed?
It's hard to say, and unfortunately he died right after I graduated high school, which is when I started, thinking even more critically and starting to find, some organized atheists and philosophers who were thinking more deeply about these things. When I was, introduced to people like the Four Horsemen, right, finding the work of Sam Harris and Dawkins, Hitchens, and I think it would have been really interesting to have those types of conversations with him, because he was an incredibly intelligent man, an electrician who understood science and how things worked. But he sought the refuge of religious belief when he needed it, and I'd like to think that it helped him, but it's hard to tell. But moving forward, I think those seeds that were planted as a young person, where my my questions, and these weren't some of the deepest questions necessarily. It wasn't like, why do we exist? Although I'm sure I asked things like that.
Sure.
There were little things that
It's at least underlying it, even if you don't phrase it that way, right?
perhaps, yeah. But I mean, other questions about science, I think that, maybe as I grew up, I had answers. I was able to find answers for. But I think one that sticks with me is I had to have been somewhere in like middle school age, and I'm starting to learn like just the basics of the ideas of physics, right? Understanding that like light is something that we can measure, and that there are photons bouncing around, and that's like what triggers the experience of sight when they hit your eyes and create these photochemical reactions, right? And I remember my grandfather, he loved cooking, and he would make these fantastic loaves of bread with like these big Italian meals for us. And I remember being out in front of my grandparents' house, and he was, cooking a loaf of bread, and I could smell it from outdoors. And I just, this fantastic smell. It's nostalgic just thinking about it. And I remember going into him and asking, I think I must have just been learning about photons and what that was. And I asked, well, what is it that's like hitting my nose, right? Like I'm trying to understand the sensory experience there. And I'm like, is part of the bread getting into my nose and triggering things, just like the photons are getting into my eyes? And then I thought about that, and I was like, what are the implications of that for things that aren't so good when they, like, that don't smell so great, right? Like, what is getting into my nose and triggering this? And I remember, like, my grandfather, who, again, incredibly intelligent man, so a man of science in many ways, being, like, just at least partially stumped, trying to understand, like, yeah, something does have to be going into your nose. And we thought about that, and then I sought out that information. And that experience of, like, being confronted with a scientific question that is based in my sensory experience, something that I'm like recording about the universe, and then seeking that information out and being fulfilled by the answers was incredibly impactful for me. And I think I don't think that I would have said this at a young age, but upon reflection, I think that is like part of what made me who I am today is being so passionate about finding answers and investigating and understanding my place in the universe and how I interact with it.
Yeah. If I might just ask a question.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, a lot of the great early scientists, of the modern scientists, not like proto-scientists from the classical world, but Renaissance type scientists, Galileo and so on, they were clearly religious. And their belief in God didn't seem to be in competition with their desire. They were quite passionate about discovery, about trying to learn the nature, the truth of the universe and how it worked. And I think there's obviously still a lot of people around today who are scientists that have religious belief. And I get that they will look at science as having a limit, that its tools are awesome for determining things about the natural world, but that it's limited to just that. There's the way they're going to look at it. So what was there a point where you felt like, and maybe you didn't even think about that kind of stuff when you were in college or high school, I don't know, but there must be a point where you're like, okay, well, I mean, obviously people have done science and still had religious belief, and they've just thought of them as somehow they overlap, but they're somehow different categories or something. So
yeah, I mean, I think
what's your reaction to that, I guess?
I think it's certainly possible, even today. I mean, it seems evident by what we hear from religious scientists that people do find ways to, have those things coexist in their minds. Yep. But for me, I think it was probably upon being introduced to people like Sam Harris, reading books like The End of Faith, and like thinking critically about the texts and what they tell us about the universe, and seeing not only that they don't answer some of the questions that I was looking for answers for, but they're also like deeply steeped in misinformation, like stuff that we just know to be incorrect about the universe today, and also highly like internally contradicting, right? And that's something that, as I've started to understand the scientific method and the ways in which we have successfully built these civilizations, right, from operating in this universe
Yeah.
the way we have, that became something that was untenable for me.
Yeah.
To hold
I
on
guess
to
the
that
idea
is,
would be that where they do overlap, like the story of creation is at least something from Genesis about the world, is your conclusion was they overlap, but the religious texts just get it wrong. Or I guess in this case you're talking about the Bible, I assume.
sure.
Yeah, it just gets it wrong. So if it gets the science wrong, then why would I keep thinking the text has much value? Is that basically a way to...
So I certainly would agree with that, but I think it's deeper than that, actually,
Okay.
because
obviously there's a lot of people who don't think that, right? They don't
Yes.
think it gets it wrong.
But early in this conversation, I identified as a skeptic and a secular humanist, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's where the key differences, or the key addition to what I'm trying to suggest about myself. I have this interest and passion for science and understanding the world, but I also want to utilize that information to find out how I can live the best life amongst fellow humans. Right. And that's another gripe that I think I have with the religious texts, right, is that they're not the best place for moral guidance. And that was something that was not only being claimed, but I was being, I didn't have any other examples as a child of where I could get that moral guidance from. I was being told that the way to live your life is through a relationship with God, and you can build that relationship by studying the Bible and what He tells us about the universe. Yeah. And I'd ask questions about, things like the Ten Commandments and their inadequacies. Like, that is supposed to be what we build our understanding of moral judgment on. It's supposed to be like how we as Christians and as Catholics, from my experience, like those are the rules, right?
Right.
And they're, just be frank, they're entirely inadequate. Why is there nothing in the Bible about why it's wrong to rape, right? I mean, that's just, to me, so, it's something that it doesn't make sense that we wouldn't cover a topic like that. And beyond that, there are also then, slavery is another good example for it. Not only is there nothing in there about why you shouldn't keep slaves, there are directions for what to do with your slaves, right? And that hit me from a young age, that was a red flag. And then as I grew as an academic and I started studying these things, formally, and as the goal of completing my master's project, I think that what that did was put those questions. Okay, maybe I take a step back there.
So let me just go back real quick, because it sounds like you're saying is also where the Bible overlapped with moral questions. It was either inadequate or also contradictory or wrong, or at least inadequate. Mm-hmm. So in the case of science, where science has a certain method and the conclusions, where they're sort of widespreadly, where they're agreed upon with a sense of confidence over a period of time, with gravity or whatever from Newton, then there's this sort of extra confidence about it. But with moral questions, there's still a very high confidence about it, but obviously the tool or the method usually isn't the same. So like rape, obviously we're not going to disagree, right, about rape as a moral question. Very few people are going to say, "Oh yeah, why do they have a problem with rape?" That's not really something you're going to find many people anyway, who are normal people, morally healthy people, are going to disagree about that. But then, do you think that you still you still can use science to arrive at that conclusion the same way and have the same confidence about it, or is it in a different category then?
No, I think that science can help us answer questions about morality. I think it has to. I think that, ultimately what we're talking about when we're talking about morality is the experience of conscious creatures, right? We're talking about what happens to creatures that have some sort of conscious engagement with the world, right? And if you, that's the bedrock for any moral discussion is, does the object in question have some experience that can be changed by the actions, right? Yeah. And if it doesn't, you can ask yourself what it would be like to find something that is the most morally relevant object in the universe, right? There's something out in space, the teacup, right? That's floating out there, and it cannot affect conscious creatures whatsoever. It can't be perceived in any way. And
Right.
it doesn't change the experience of anything at all. Well, to ask how that is the most morally relevant object is just, I mean, it doesn't make sense. I don't know what you mean by morally relevant if it can't change things.
Yeah.
And so,
Because most people tend to think that science, you'll hear this a lot, right? That science tells us what is, but it can't tell us what ought. But you're saying, no, it can tell us what ought.
yeah,
Is that right?
and I don't think that, it doesn't mean that it's easy, and it doesn't mean that we understand it all at this point, right? Like, I think it's possible that we don't know what we're missing in some spaces, right? And so, when we ask ourselves, what ought to be? Well, what ought to be, if there is something we can say it ought to be, it's I don't want to say this. It is something that exists in this universe as a substantiation of, like, physical properties, right? The experience of human beings is at base level happening in our brains, right?
Yeah.
If we're accepting what we learn from neuroscience,
Right.
our experiences are like epiphenomenon of the electrochemical reactions going on in your brains or in relation with everything else that's going on. It's an incredibly complex system. And I think that it's possible that the more we learn about neuroscience, the more we learn about our brains, the easier it will become for us to understand how different actions have experience on conscious creatures. And if those actions have impacts that are negative. I think Sam Harris in The Moral Landscape made this argument that, if you imagine as a thought experiment that there's the worst possible suffering for everybody, right? This absolute hell where there's no silver lining, things don't get better as a result of going through the suffering. It's just misery for everyone forever.
Yeah.
If you imagine that, and then just take that as the starting point, and then imagine something that's slightly less misery than that, right?
Yeah.
That's better. And if it's not, if you don't think that bedrock of misery is bad, then I don't know what you mean by bad, right? We have to start with terms that we agree upon, and that's a place that we can start. We can talk about what it means to be bad, and I'm defining that as bad. I'm not saying that it's impossible philosophically to argue against that. I just haven't heard anything that convinces me otherwise.
Right.
So if that's bad, and we know that we can, there are certain actions, there are certain things that can happen in the universe that are moving away from that on a spectrum, right? Something that is not as bad as the worst possible misery for everyone forever, then we can have a working definition of what is good and what is bad, right? Things that are better are moving away from that suffering. And it is, I think, possible scientifically that we can understand how our actions influence the experience of conscious creatures to place them on that spectrum, where they are on the spectrum of good and evil, of good and bad, I should say.
So my background's in classics, classical studies.
Sure.
So I read a lot of classical philosophers and stuff in school, and of course they make a lot of arguments that philosophy, what was at the time proto-science, I guess, does influence our moral conclusions and so on. So the first time I ever heard Sam Harris in a podcast or whatever, I was like, wait, he sounds like he's an Aristotelian. That's just what it sounded like to me. But have you, like in the process of all that, did you ever think, oh, hey, I should really go look at like Aquinas' arguments for God, so I understand that at least, like what their best case is, before I make a decision about what I think about God? Or was it much more organic and personal and not that kind of a journey?
Yeah, I certainly have looked at a variety of different philosophy and spent a lot of my personal time as a student trying to learn, I think what modern Christians, how they embody their faith, how they act upon their beliefs, because that's what was important to me as a student, was to see, okay, yes, we can have these big philosophical conversations about these issues, but when it comes to, making a difference in the world and trying to coexist with the billions of people that we live on this earth with, understanding how beliefs are, how they influence action was the key to my work. So I don't know that I spent so much time with like someone like Aquinas. I certainly have
I just threw him
interacted
out
with
because
that
he's
work.
famous.
Yeah.
He's very popular with Roman Catholic circles. That's why I
Sure.
mention him.
Sure.
Because I see like a Catholic apologist, on YouTube, and they're giving arguments for the existence of God or for these moral questions and stuff. So I was just thinking, did you ever like go to the YouTube and look up Catholic apologists or something, and that kind of the people who were defending the faith, more intellectually and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly made my rounds and tried to consume as much of this as possible, and
Yeah.
I'm just not convinced by the arguments. I
Yeah.
mean, I think that's what I think is important as a skeptic, in addition to identifying myself as an atheist
Yeah.
or even a humanist. I think the fact that I'm open to argument, right? I'm skeptical as a rule. But that doesn't mean that I'm cynical or that I shut down other people's beliefs. I try to absorb as much as I can from all of them, and I chew on that and see how it reflects on what I understand about the universe. And if I get information, if I get an argument that really helplessly changes my viewpoint. I mean, when you're convinced by something, it's not an act of free will, right? It's like you are a slave to reason. When somebody tells you,
Feels that way, you mean, experientially?
I think it really is. I mean, I think that when
Like you can't unsee it.
when you actually absorb the rules of mathematics, when you understand how that works, and you are confronted with 2 + 2 = 4, it's not really a conscious decision to say 4 is the answer to that.
Yeah.
It's like you are drawn to that conclusion by the logic, and I think that's how it is with all of our decisions, if you will. Everything that we experience in the world, we are drawn by what we understand about the universe and the logic that we've built using those tools. And I haven't been convinced by the argument of the apologists.
I was just curious if they were just like a part of the journey. Did you did you find when you were in the phase of, I guess, going from what I guess would have been somewhat of a belief growing up when you were young, because I had some Catholic background as well when I was really young, but already by middle school I knew I didn't believe in God, just personally, and it wasn't until college years that I converted to Christianity. But did you feel like you must have read some of the Bible, like the Gospels or whatever?
Sure.
Did you tend to focus on one part as you were going through all this time? Like, did you tend to read much even of the Bible during this time? I'm just thinking like high school into college, that kind of
I tried, and I think in the Sunday school atmosphere, we were introduced to a lot that was, we were reading parts of the Bible, but they were largely out of like sort of watered down texts, right? They were just, it was more of like a school class book.
A moral lesson.
That was, that was breaking down like what the important parts of.
So you weren't like just
Bible
taking
was.
up the Gospel of Matthew or something and reading that?
I did occasionally. I mean, I had a Bible that I had in my room as a child, and I'd pick it up and I'd dig through it. I think that it wasn't until college when I was, writing on the topic of religion that I started reading through entire parts of the Bible in its entirety. And I mean, that was, if I needed another nail in the coffin, that would have been it.
That was
right?
it. So and you weren't reading with like, also, were you at the same time reading Sam Harris or people like that, or were you just reading the Bible just on your own trying to work through it? Or had you already gotten
by college,
begun to get shaped by the Four Horsemen or whatever?
Yeah, by the time I was in college, I was identifying as an atheist, and I think I was interested in the work of the Four Horsemen and others, right? That had started to, provide me a toolkit to work through these issues.
Do you think you were able to read them objectively, I guess, if that's the right word for it? Because, as soon as any of us get influenced by a way of thinking, it's hard to not it's hard to set that aside no matter how skeptical you're trying to be. I find for me, it's very, very hard to set it aside, either side, you know what I mean? Like once you start being influenced, but I'm just curious if you...
Yeah, I mean, as objectively as I read anything, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I think by definition, if I'm reading it, I'm coming to it with some amount of baggage that is my history and what I've already read. And what the important part of it is to me is that I was convinced by these arguments, right?
Yeah.
And I think that, yeah.
Did you have anything that you, like, let's say when you're a few years after college, say, have you looked back and been like, one thing I really miss about this, about what I used to think, or maybe your parents still believe, or whatever, or something about this? What does that ever happen where you're like, I do kind of miss this? Because obviously people who believe, right, whether they're able to say it or not, I think the general idea is that they feel like their belief in God or Christianity or probably whatever the religion is, it provides kind of a horizon line that organizes the world for them, and then from that point on, those are the crosshairs they use to look at things, at least in the big picture, and it sort of orients it. Or maybe it's the hope of the resurrection, that there's life, or maybe it's all of that. I don't know, but I'm just curious for you, if there's, because obviously when you don't believe stuff anymore you used to believe, there may be something, I don't know, you miss, I don't know.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I don't know that I've ever confronted it directly. I mean, nothing comes to mind, to be honest, because when I think about,
because knowing you're going to die, and
right.
If I would think, because I used to not believe anything happened after you died, right? I just thought you died.
Of
and
course.
that seemed a little more depressing than the view I have now.
Yeah, of course, the
I
idea
don't want to feed that one into you. I was trying to see what you thought.
The idea of an afterlife is comforting. So if I had to answer, right, if you're, I would say that sure, when I did believe that my family members were in another place, that was comforting. But I don't know that, like, I would say that I miss that, because even though I believed it at some point, that doesn't make it true, right?
Yeah.
To say that I miss it, I think is an accurate description of my mental state, because what I know is that if that isn't true, which I don't believe that it is, then I was mistaken, and I was perhaps delusional, right? I was operating in such a way that I was making decisions and acting upon the world in a way that does not reflect reality.
Yeah.
And I certainly don't miss that.
It's probably not a good question when I really think of it, to be honest. It's probably not the great question, because, I mean, I wouldn't, it's the vanilla sky thing, like I don't want to go back and live in a world where I thought something was true that was false,
Right.
Like why would I ever want that?
Well, I mean, some people might, because of the fact that it is difficult work emotionally and philosophically to find a way to operate in this world that is fulfilling without some cosmic answers delivered to you from the creator of the universe, right?
I mean,
if you didn't have that imposed on you from a young age, then perhaps it's easier. I don't know. I don't have that experience, but to have
don't you think we would just, our human nature is to seek some sort of cosmic orientation? The question of why we're here, where we came from, and what's our destiny as humans, and why are we like we are and stuff. I mean, those seem like they're pretty common no matter.
Sure, but I think answers that science has given us about our history, who we are genetically and anthropologically, and things of that nature. I mean, they give us answers that are demonstrable, answers that are testable, and answers that tell us not only about our past, not only about who we are, but like what we can make of ourselves, what sort of questions we want to answer about how we can be better moving forward. I mean, things like our advances in medicine, right? The fact that we've identified what ails human beings and we've tried to solve for those problems. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that is fulfilling for me, is to see how that unfolds. That's the big cosmic question, is like, hey, if we're floating around on this pale blue dot and we've got problems to solve here, that's our destiny, right? Like we need to figure that out. We need to work together to imagine that. I mean, that's to me, that's beautiful. The fact that we are just this unintended and unplanned circumstance that the lights turned on, right? That's we don't understand consciousness yet, but if we take a naturalist perspective and believe that everything that exists is just natural, right, as opposed to supernatural, right?
Do you think there's immaterial reality in the that's natural, I guess? Like, is mathematics just in our head a projection, or is it something that's real? Because it's obviously immaterial.
I think mathematics is a language that we use to describe the world, right?
So you don't, but I mean, do you think it's something outside of us, mind independent or whatever?
I don't think so. I mean, it's certainly, if we're talking about like, do numbers of things exist? I mean, if we find that, if you set 2 apples down on the table in front of me and ask me, does 2 exist? I mean, that's a question that
I think of it more like this would be my example, would be like a basketball. We can hold it in our hands and it's a sphere in its shape. And if I cut the thing up with a razor, and take all and de-inflate it and then lay out all the rubber pieces of the basketball flat, I would say that the sphereness, the geometry of the basketball when it's round is something that seems real and not just in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're getting at here is the idea of like Platonic ideals, like the fact that there are things, like I don't think that there...
I really was just asking about mathematics, that's all. Most people think morality is mind independent. They live as if murdering a 3-year-old, is some deep wrong that's independent of chemistry and biology and so on. They live like that. They think it's something that's not just...
I think that's born of a lack of
just mind
understanding of biology and chemistry, right? The reason that killing a 3-year-old is wrong is that it will impact the lives of conscious creatures, namely the 3-year-old who's now been deprived of any positive experience that he possibly could have been, but also of, anyone who loved that individual who now has to cope with the loss and what it means to be in relationship to a murderer, to know that there is this type of person out there. Like, you are putting so much on that scale of, complete misery to the best possible well-being of humans. You are moving us towards that worst possible misery by committing that act.
All I was trying to say was most people probably think of morality as mind independent, it's not just a projection of my particular opinion out of my own brain or of a collective of brains, but I'm not telling you they're right or not.
Sure.
I'm saying that's the way probably most people view it, just intuitively.
Yeah, and I think
it feels that way. They tend to think of it that way.
I think to get around that, it's a matter of understanding consciousness. If we're able to get a deeper science of consciousness to understand why we have experiences at all and why they take different shapes and colors, we'll be able to have a more robust conversation about this, because right now it's very difficult to communicate on these topics. But
I guess you'd be, by the way, a materialist then?
Yes.
As well,
yes. That's,
more
philosophically, I'd identify one. Yeah. Okay. Because it's, I mean, the idea that if we were all like not conscious, right? If there was no conscious experiences, we're just robots going around, then what sort of ground can you stand on that killing the 3-year-old robot is morally wrong if nothing experiences that, right? I don't know that there is an argument there. It's kind of, there's nothing to have experienced right or wrong in that scenario. So it's just like that morally relevant teacup we talked about earlier. It's like, what does it mean for that to be relevant if it's not affecting the experience of anything? So I think that's got to be our starting conversation. And by definition, that's about the biology and chemistry, at least for us. I mean, there could be some creatures out in the universe that don't share our biology, but are still conscious, and we would have to incorporate that into our understanding of morality. At this time, I mean, we have a very preliminary understanding of how our experience emerges from the biology and chemistry of our brains, how minds emerge from the brains. And there are implications of that are really tough to interact with, like the issue of animal suffering, right? I mean, if a dog has any sort of conscious experience, if the lights are on for a dog and it's not just that it's like a robot running around, then abusing that dog takes on a lot more of a moral weight.
Yeah.
In a way that kicking a rock down the road doesn't. Presumably, rocks are not conscious. I mean, there are philosophical strains of thought that believe that that everything that's consciousness is inherent to the fabric of reality. And if we were to find evidence for that was convincing, we would have a lot of moral reckoning. We would have things we'd have to understand, we'd have to cope with, we'd have to change our ways. But there's a reason why, me standing up right now and kicking a student that walks by is a morally objectionable issue in a way that if I go kick that pile of rocks out there, no one's going to really bat an eye. I mean, you might think I'm a little strange kicking that pile of rocks, but they're not going to ask necessarily moral questions about my action in the same way as they are, is that if I'm inflicting harm on another conscious creature. And the fact that that's I think that's something that most people would agree with. We would understand that when you work through that issue. I think it is convincing, but I don't know that that's how, it's certainly not how religious traditions have taught morality, and I think it's just a matter of communicating more effectively about the science of the mind and about our experience, and we're just at the start of that.
One final question.
Absolutely.
How do you be skeptical of your skepticism? Like how do you, because you obviously have a lot of skepticism of what you knew when you were young, or the beliefs in the Bible and so on. So sometimes when I'm talking to people who are skeptical, it doesn't feel like they're as skeptical of their current position as they are of their former one. And a part of me thinks I understand that. Like it's really hard to look at your own, whatever your current view is, because it feels like it's the true one, But at the same time, I'm just like truly wondering, like what do you think, like how do you be skeptical of the very foundations of secular, how'd you call it? Secular
humanism?
Yeah, secular humanism. Well, I thought there was something else with it, but anyway.
I'd say skepticism and secular humanism are
so like in a way, like how do you be skeptical of that? Like that whole thing may just be wrong.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think I have a two-part answer. First is that I think because I have already gone through that reckoning with my Christianity, right? That I have been. I'd come to conclusions about the nature of reality through the Christian lens, and I had to. Okay, let me restart that. I think that because I've already gone through that with my Christianity, where I had a set of beliefs, and through thinking critically about them, I had abandoned them and replaced them with other views on the world. It might be easier for me to be open to that sort of transition moving forward. So if I'm presented with information that contradicts my beliefs, maybe, and I mean, because if I were presented with information that contradicts my beliefs, I've already gone through it, right? So I think if I'm convinced by an argument, I will take that in, and it'll be my new working argument. It'll be how I see the world. And believe me, things still do change my perspective on things. I read a lot. I'm trying to consume as much as I can about the current state of science and the current understanding of the universe. And I certainly don't think that I understand it all.
Yeah, it seems like a pretty reasonable answer to me. I said that was my final question. Actually, I do have one more. I just thought of one, which is what?
Well, actually, before
go ahead.
You finish.
You finish.
I do want to add the other part. No,
you did say two things.
I think that the second part is that what I've replaced that religious belief with isn't a new set of dogma, right? So I'm not replacing Christian belief with scientific or skeptical belief per se. What I'm replacing with is the process of science, which
Isn't that a dogma, the process of science?
No, I
The
don't.
commitment to that being the source of all truth? Or
But I don't think you have to. I don't think like what I see science as, and I think what most scientists today see science as, is that process. You don't have to believe anything without evidence to use those tools, right? It's not a series, it's not a set of beliefs that you are asked to take in. It is a process that by its nature you use those tools to interact with the universe. And if what it's about making a hypothesis and then testing it, right? Yep. And if you make a hypothesis and then use the tools of science to test it, and you do not get, and it doesn't stand up to that scrutiny, then you cast aside those beliefs.
Do you think you can do that, like even like when you decide whether you're going to get married and stuff? Like big consequential decisions that are personal, relational, or whatever. Can you do the same thing?
I think so. I mean, I think I've done it already in a lot of my big decisions in life. I mean, I am married now, and my wife and I have talked about the question about whether or not we'd like to have kids, right? And we had to kind of work through what that means for us as a family and as individuals. And ultimately, given what we understand about the universe and our own lives and our own goals, we decided that we don't want to have kids. And that's a process that we have thought critically about, what it means for us, what it could mean for us. And I think that, yeah, I have done that. I
think most people would probably think, like, in deciding to get married, the process is very different from doing research on quantum mechanics. I think most people would tend to think it doesn't really work the exact same.
Well, I mean, I would ask them why it doesn't. I mean, okay. I think the emotional weight
of the
decision
data is not
like
so
that.
dispositive, right?
Well,
like it can't tell you exactly what the conclusion is.
Sure, but
it's impersonal versus personal.
Well, the data can tell you what you can expect that marriage to play out to be. I mean, there are data on how many people get divorced in the end, and that's something you might want to consider when you're getting married.
I wasn't saying. First of all, I was just saying the way people generally perceive it is they would probably think of those as not that there's like people are supposed to chuck their brain and all research, all common sense, all wisdom that can be gained from anything in deciding about marriage. I just meant that the personal side of it tends to be very different from doing science. That's all I meant.
Well, I think that personal side of it is, at base, subject to the laws of nature, right? I mean, like, there are things going on in our brain. They are physical things that are happening. And the more we understand about how those processes play out, I think we actually can use the tools of neuroscience to help us to make decisions about how we live our lives. I don't know that we're there yet, but I don't think that by definition those things are completely separate. I think we have gaps in our understanding of our experience.
All right, so my final question was, what sort of morally, because there's the famous love your neighbors yourself, do to others as you would have them to do. It's pretty famous bedrock for sort of Western values in general. But what do you think is like the huge improvement on your moral outlook now versus what Jesus was teaching?
I think from understanding what I do about the human mind and the architecture of it, what makes up our experience biologically, I have been forced to think critically and ultimately abandon the idea of free will. And that is something that is, I think, bedrock to the Christian worldview, right? Mm-hmm. That part of the reason why there is so much evil, if you want to give it that word, in the world is because God gave us free will, and we are free to act in that way, and we are being influenced by the devil or otherworldly figures that have brought about that havoc and destruction and all of that. And in abandoning the concept of free will, I think it has opened up what I think is counterintuitive to a lot of people, but it has opened up a space for a compassion that I didn't know that I had or didn't have at some point when I thought.
Which you don't offer freely, I guess.
Yes, yes.
Right.
But I think it's because right. It's there's a deeper conversation to be had here. I think that you have to start with a definition of what we mean by free will, right? It's
let me step back one step from that.
Yeah.
I guess you would mean that because obviously compassion's like it's one of the major emphases in the New Testament, right, from Jesus.
Yeah.
So that's not really that would just be a similar idea, I guess, right?
a similar idea in that. Well, what I mean by compassion compared
Or maybe
to what,
you just have a different, maybe you mean something very different from the way it's in the New Testament or something, I don't know.
well, I don't know.
Because like if you said, I used to be a Christian, I used to kind of follow the moral framework of Jesus' teaching, but now I favor compassion. Like most people are going to go, what? That's just more or less the same thing, you know?
Well, I don't think that despite the idea that Christianity is a faith based in love and compassion, I don't know that it's all that compassionate.
You use the terms, but you're saying like when it says love your neighbor, do to them as you would, all the stuff Jesus said about if they ask for a cloak, give them 2 coats, all this kind of stuff is in the end, it's not really compassion.
Well, is it all that compassionate to tell your fellow Christians that, they were born into this world of no choice of their own and forced to operate within the confines of this world, and if they don't participate in it in a certain way that sometimes is very difficult to do based on their biology or their upbringing, so the place in which they were born, that they are damned to burn forever. That's not an incredibly compassionate idea to me.
So I guess the way, you tell me if I'm saying this right, what you would say then is that Christianity sort of used these terms like love and mercy and compassion, but forbearance, but really it's a kind of fraudulent use of these terms or something.
And that's not to say that no Christians love or feel compassion or do any of this. It's just that I think Christianity isn't...
At least, let's just talk about Jesus. From just looking at his teaching, you just were trying to, I think draw some other things from his teaching. But you're saying he would have used the terms, but you think the way you think of love and compassion now is sort of vastly superior to the framework he was working with or something?
Not necessarily. I don't know if I'd use the words vastly superior. I think that a lot of Jesus's teachings are good lessons, right? I think a lot of what you get from a lot of religions is workable. They're the golden rule is a rule that makes sense. To treat others how you want to be treated is
Parable
fine.
of the Good Samaritan or whatever certainly sounds nice.
But it's a matter of how there's 2 things at work there. Is like how we're getting to those conclusions, and how and what other baggage comes with those beliefs, right? And so I don't think that Christianity is necessary or even sufficient to really make an argument for love and compassion. I mean, I think that the reasons that we're told, at base boil down to, like God told you to, right?
Yeah.
There's this figure in the sky or wherever that is ultimately threatening you with hellfire to not act a certain way.
How does that square with like the idea that he was crucified freely according to the Gospels? So how even just trying to make sense of it, like how at one level he's dying for everybody, so that seems like that's pretty nice.
Well,
right?
It's never quite made sense to me why that was the path in which salvation came. It's like God created the universe and the mechanics of it, right? He could have lined those things up any way he'd like, and there was, in the realm of possibility, his whatever limitations he put on the universe, one possible way that the world could have played out, even given free will, right? Given the decision-making processes, is that he would have to send himself as a human to the earth to be murdered to save the people. I mean, that's just the logic there never lined up for me. It's like, what are the mechanics in which his death in that circumstance gave us any sort of salvation? What is that? And that's a question I've asked Christians for the better part of the past couple decades, and we're told God works in mysterious ways.
That would not seem very convincing to me, if that was the answer. I wouldn't be persuaded by that. I have a thought on it, but I was trying to just try to understand what you meant earlier about it says this, but then Jesus also said this, and then when you look at the whole thing, it's sort of a rejection. I've always thought, just for my part, that the idea was that human life is infinitely valuable, and so sin damages the world infinitely because humans are that valuable, and so his death relates to the fact that that's like the value. That's what justice is. It's the value of the damage done from sin. If someone murders my daughter, then there's no if someone said, hey, this person murdered your daughter, so we're going to have him give you $500,000. I would be like, what? They could say, I'm going to give you $100 trillion, and I would say that wouldn't even come close to her value.
Right.
There's no material value that equates to her. The only thing that equates to her life, is life. Life it's supremely valuable. So I always thought that was sort of the idea behind his death, is that sin has damaged the world. Well, how do you measure that? What would be the measurement to that? The only measurement is life. That's why life is for life for life. Because the only thing that equates to it.
There's some sort of magical thinking embedded in that, though. Is that I still would demand some sort of physics of the transaction there to really be convinced that
life is that valuable, you mean?
No, but what he did in dying changed the future of humanity. How did that pave us a pathway into heaven? And again, if God created the limits of the universe, if he built this architecture, then he built that into it. And that's a question that I have. Why?
Yeah.
Why is that a possible outcome when he created the universe? I mean, we're told that it's because he gave us free will and that he allowed us to make that mistake. And I just think that that's an absurd thing to worship as a creature who would do that. But then I'm confronted with the idea of a deeper questioning of the concept of free will, and to not find it when I seek it. Right? I mean, this is something that a number of philosophers have looked at, and I think that when you abandon the idea of us having free will, it becomes a lot more difficult to cast blame on others and to revel in something like revenge, right? And instead, it opens up for me, and I think many others who've gone down this path, an experience of understanding that we are all just stardust operating on this planet, and we are subject to the laws of physics, and things are going to play out as they do, and we're kind of just along for the ride. The concept of judgment per se takes on a different weight when you think of the world in those terms, especially when you're not being threatened by hellfire on the other end. We were asking people to treat each other well because we know what it's like to be treated well and what it's like to not be treated well, and we can make judgments on that based on our experience, right? It's a work in progress. It's something that we're developing, and I think that's that's to me more. It's a project that I want to be involved in, and I appreciate that project, and I want to play my part in it.
Great.
More than I want to be, you know, told. Yeah, maybe I'll just end it with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Appreciate the conversation.
Yeah,
Truly.
absolutely.
I'm sure we could go on and on. Maybe we'll get you to the regular podcast at some point.
Sure. Yeah, this is fun.
So really enjoy that. But thanks for having or agreeing to the podcast, and hope you have a good conference.
Yeah, you as well. Thank you.
All right.